Myst, the Book of Atrus, continues as read by the bathroom reader. I am covering for the Plurality Report, who is currently running an eBay tracking cookie scam with Brian Dunning. What? Wait, what, again? Chapter 3. In the blistering heat of the late afternoon sun, faint wisps of sulphurous steam rose from tiny fumaroles in the volcano's mouth, coiling like a dancer's veils in that shadowy dark beneath the edge before they vanished in the intense glare above. Atrus stood on the lip of the volcano, staring out across the deep bowl of the caldera, his glasses, the largest of the two pairs that had hung in his grandmother's workroom, pulled down over his face, the thick leather band hugging the back of his shaven head tightly beneath the white cloth hood he wore. Over his mouth and nose was the cloth mask Anna had made for him and insisted that he wear, while about his waist was a thick belt studded with tools, a perfect copy of the one his grandmother wore about her own. 14 now. Atrus had grown fast this past year. He was almost a man's height, but he had yet to fill out. His face, too, had changed, taking on the harder, more angular shapes of manhood, both nose and chin having lost the softness they had in childhood. He was not a weak boy, not by any means, yet watching him from the top of the cleft wall, Anna noted how thin he was. When the desert winds blew, she was afraid they would carry him away, there seemed so little of him. For the past few weeks he had been setting up his experiment. Now he was ready to begin. Turning, Atrus clambered down, out of the burning light into the deep, much cooler shadow just below the lip. Here, on a narrow ledge, he had rigged up most of his equipment. Straight ahead, the volcano wall fell away steeply, while to his right, just beyond a curiously rounded rock that looked as though it had been formed from melting mud, was a narrow vent. Above it, he had placed a dome cap made of beaten metal. It was crudely manufactured but effective, and he had stacked it to the surrounding rock with 4 thick pins. On the top of the dome was fixed a small metal cylinder. Atrus reached up, his gloved hands gently turning the tiny knobs on either side of his glasses, adjusting the opacity of the lenses so that he could see better. Then, brushing a fine layer of dust from the top of the metal cap, he leaned forward and studied the finger-length silver valve, checking its welding for the dozenth time before glancing at the 2 crudely calibrated gauges that were set into the dome's face to either side of the valve. Just above each of the dials was a thumb-sized metal stud, a small circular hole bored through the top of each. Atrus straightened, letting out a long breath. He had one chance at this, so it had to be right. If it went wrong, if it didn't work, then it would be a year or more before they could get all the parts they needed from the traders. He turned, looking up to where 2 big coiled wires he had made himself under Anna's supervision, dangled over the edge of the crater. Just above them, jutting out over the drop, was a long arm of jet-black stone. 2 small wheels had been pinned into its face at the far end where it overhung the volcano. A hand-woven rope ran between the wheels, forming a winch. Like the cap, it seemed crude, yet it would serve its purpose perfectly. To test it, Atrus had spent several afternoons lowering rocks into that maw, then raising them again, rocks many times the weight of the load it would have to carry now. On the other side of the crater's lip, just next to where the rock arm was weighed down by a pile of heavy stones, sheltered by a makeshift tent, was his pride and joy, the beginning and end of all this patient endeavor, his battery. Reaching up, he grasped one of the wires, pulling it toward him, drawing out enough of its length so that it stretched to the metal cap. Attaching it to one of the studs, he then repeated the process. Adjusting his glasses, he clambered back up the wall and over the lip. out into the burning sunlight. For a moment he stood there, getting his breath. Each time he emerged from the shadow, it was like stepping into a furnace. Nor did it matter how often he did it. Every time that change from the cool of the shade to the sudden, stifling heat of the open was like a physical blow. Ducking under the thick cloth screen of the tent, Atrus smiled. This time he had tried hard to look at all the angles, to make sure he took all aspects of the whole into account in his calculations. The battery rested in the corner of the tent against a ledge of rock. Looking at the massive thing, Atrus felt a justifiable pride. He had cut the block of stone himself and, using Anna's finest cutting tools, had hollowed it, following the design in the ancient Dani book. Making the plates for the battery was comparably easy. Chemicals lay in abundance in the dry soil surrounding the volcano, and he had been fortunate to find a large deposit of galena, the ore containing a mixture of sulfur and lead, not far from the cleft. As for the sulfuric acid he had needed, the one substance that was in abundance on the volcano was sulfur. Indeed, when he finally came to make it, the only thing that had limited the size of the battery was its weight. Adjusting his lenses once again, Atrus knelt and studied it proudly. He had spent many nights buffing and polishing the stone, then on a whim had carved 3 ancient Dani words into its side, the complex characters tiny, elaborate works of art in themselves. Light, power, force. It looked like a tiny stone house, the metallic glint of its terminals giving it a strange, exotic look. Beside it, altogether different, lay a second, much smaller box, the explosive device. This one was made of an unglazed red clay, cast in his grandmother's kiln. Undecorated, the single rounded aperture on its top face was plugged with a hard seal of wax, from the center of which jutted a length of thick twine which he had treated with a solution of various highly reactive chemicals. On its front face was a thick clay handle. Carefully he picked it up and, wrapping it in his cloak, carried it outside. Easing his way over the lip once more, he steadied himself, one hand against the rough, crumbling wall, as he edged down onto the ledge. Setting the box down, he turned and, standing on tiptoe, reached up and caught hold of the thick metal hook on the end of the rope, gently tugging at it, hearing the brake mechanism click, then click again on the far side of the rim. That, too, was his own invention. On some of the earliest trials of the winch, he had found that the rock dragged the rope down too much too quickly, and when he tried to slow it, the rope had burned his palms. After much experimentation, he had devised a way of stopping the supply wheel after each rotation so that the winch could only be operated by a series of gentle tugs. Bending down, he picked the box up again and slipped the curved tip of the hook through its handle, then turned back and, holding the rope out away from him, slowly lowered it over the drop. As the rope went taut, he moved back. There was only one more thing to do now. Reaching into the inner pocket of his cloak, he removed the ancient Dani tinderbox. Leaning over, one hand supporting him against the rock arm, he held the flame beneath the end of the twine fuse on the dangling box, then, when it had caught, released the catch and stepped back. For a moment he thought it had gone out, then, with a fizz, it began to burn fiercely. Atrus turned and, half running up the slope, scrambled over the rim, making for the winch. This was the most crucial part. If the fuse burned too quickly, or if for some reason the winch jammed, things would go wrong. Kneeling beside the brake wheel, he slowly began to turn it, listening to it click and click and click, all the while tensed against a sudden detonation, all the while counting in his head. When he had counted to 20, he threw himself down, stretched out flat behind the pile of stones, his hands over his ears. 24, 25, 26. The explosion rocked the side of the volcano. It had been 4 seconds early. Even so, that didn't matter. The box would have been in the correct place, opposite the fault. Atrus laughed, then, dusting himself off, stood. As the echoes died, he could hear, through the ringing in his ears, the sound he'd hoped to hear. The strong hiss of steam forcing its way through the cap, and an accompanying high-pitched mechanical whine. Still laughing, he climbed up onto the lip and looked down. The winch arm had gone, as had a large chunk of the ledge, but the vent, protected by the huge rock, was fine. Steam hissed from the cap in a steady, forceful stream. Turning, looking down at Anna where she stood on the cleft wall, he raised his arms and waved to her eagerly, grinning with triumph. "It works!" he yelled, pulling the mask down from his nose to his mouth. "It works!" From below, Anna waved back to him. Then, cupping her hands before her mouth, she shouted something, but it was difficult to make out what she was saying. His ears were ringing so much. Besides, the furious hissing of the steam, that high-pitched whine, seemed to grow by the moment. "Go back," she'd said, or something like it. Grinning, he nodded, then, waving to her again, turned back to watch the hissing cap. "It worked," he said quietly, noting how the cap was trembling now, rattling against the 4 restraining pins. "It really worked." Climbing down, he went across and, taking care not to get too close, edged around until he could see the gauges. Yes! A thrill of excitement went through him, seeing how both arrows were deep in the red. It was passing a charge. He stood back, grinning, then felt himself go cold. Even as he watched, one of the metal pins began to move, easing itself slowly from its berth within the rock, as though some invisible but mighty hand were pulling it from the stone. Slowly he began to edge away. As he did, the noise from the cap changed, rising a full octave, as if that same invisible hand had pressed down on the key of an organ. Atrus turned and, scrambling up the slope and over the rim, began to run, ignoring the impact of the heat, fighting it. But it was like running through some thick, glutinous substance. He had gone barely 10 paces when he fumbled forward, coming up facing the way he'd come. As he did, the whole of the rim behind him seemed to lift into the air. Coming to, Atrus looked up, surprised by the sight that met his eyes. On every side the great walls of the volcano stretched up, forming a jagged circle where they met the startling blueness of the sky. He was in the crater. The rim must have given way. Slowly he got to his feet. Steam billowed across the rock-cluttered floor of the volcano, concealing its far edges. From time to time a figure would form from the clouds, the crystalline shapes strangely beautiful. He saw the battery at once. Going over to it, he crouched, then shook his head. Amazed by its condition, it was virtually untouched. The polished stone exterior had a few buffs and scratches, but it was still in one piece. Moreover, the dial on the top showed that it was fully charged. Atrus laughed, delighted. Reaching out, he smoothed its upper surface almost lovingly. At least he knew now that the principle was sound. If he could only find the right vent, if he could only get the pressure right, then it would work and they would have an unlimited supply of electricity. Their lives would be transformed. The cleft would shine like a cat's eye in the desert night. Smiling, Atrus raised his head, looking directly ahead of him. For a moment, a cloud of steam obscured his view. Then, as it cleared, he found himself staring into blackness. It was a cave, or a tunnel of some kind. He stood, then took a step toward it. Strange, it seemed almost as though it had been carved from the surrounding rock. The steam swirled back, concealing it. "Atrus!" He turned up, looking at Anna, high above him, silhouetted against the crater's lip. Come up here now!" Atrus frowned. "But my battery! Now!" Walking back, she was unnaturally silent. Then suddenly she stopped and turned to face him. "Atrus, what did you see?" "I saw—" He hesitated, surprised by her question. "Atrus, answer me. What did you see?" My battery was charged." She let out her breath. "And was that all?" "There was steam, lots of steam." He frowned then. "My battery! I've got to go get my battery!" He made to turn back, but she placed a hand gently on his arm. "Forget the battery. It's too dangerous. Now come, let's clean you up."